Hello and welcome. Today I'm joined by Grant Downie, who is physiotherapist and consultant in medical and performance solutions. So Grant, thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
No problem. And before I go into asking where you're from, whereabouts are you currently?
I now live in the Isle of Arran in Scotland, and for those who don't know Scotland, that's on the west coast, the most southerly island, about 24 miles by about 12 miles, 5,000 people. So slightly different to Manchester, Middlesbrough and Rangers or Glasgow, where I used to work.
Yeah, no, the last time I saw you was in Manchester. So yeah, no, it's good to see. And you've got a very Scottish themed wooden backdrop there. So that looks very nice.
Very Celtic, yes.
So yeah, whereabouts do you actually grow up from then?
My parents are Scottish. I was born, actually, my father was a civil engineer, so he travelled around. My sisters were born in Ireland. I was born in the north of England, but we hail from Kilmarnock, so we consider ourselves Scots. But I was brought up in Penrith, went to school there, and then studied physiotherapy in Newcastle upon Tyne.
Right, okay, so you were born in England and you grew up there?
Sadly, yes, I blame my parents for it. Yes, being a Scot. No, but we joke about that quite a lot because I consider myself a Scot. But yes, I was born in Penrith.
Right, okay. So, and then why was it about physio? What was it that you particularly wanted to do that?
Do you know, it's strange, isn't it? I was asked this question recently, and I remember one night, and I go back a long, long way. So your older people will remember there used to be a programme called Sports Night with Coleman, and it was way, way back in the time on a Wednesday night when no football was live. And Manchester United were playing Manchester City, and the late Colin Bell suddenly went down in a box in a heap. And I think Manchester United brought down the field and scored. I can remember this player being carried off the pitch, and my father just said to me one day that night, why don't you want to be a trainer? And I thought, what is a trainer? And I got this idea, what is this? And I remember actually then following through Shoot the magazine, Colin Bell's recovery from this injury, and then going to the local hospital and finding out what a physio did. And I knew I was not a bad footballer. I mean, when I say not bad, I was never going to play professional or even semi-professional, but I could play rugby, I could play cricket. I was pretty good at all sports, but not great at any. But I love sport. And I also wanted to do something practical. I was dyslexic as a child, so reading and writing was not natural to me. And then when I went to the hospital, I thought I maybe wouldn't mind being a physio. So therefore, I studied hard for my A-levels, which I was able to pass, or got the necessary grades. I wouldn't have passed to the level today that physios have to get into because they're much higher. But I got in, and the rest's history.
And how much in demand was physio then? You said it seemed to be a bit easier back then to get into that area, but how?
I think it was a very popular profession, but what it wasn't at that time was as academic as it is now. And they've raised the standards highly. Sometimes I think that's a good thing. Sometimes I don't think it's a good thing. Where I think it's a good thing, it's made the profession much more scientific. Where it's a bad thing, we have to be able to connect with people. And some of these highly intelligent people, from an academic perspective, maybe lack some of the emotional intelligence of some of the more not as academic people as me. So it's a combination. So it's not wrong, but I think there's a high demand to get in still. And again, in those days, it was predominantly probably a profession by females. So on my course, I think there was 30 or 40 people, 4 males and the rest were females. And that was pretty common in those days.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say that actually, because like within our team, we've always had a high number of either graduate rehabs, sports rehabilitators, or graduate sports therapists, and it was more down to like the fit within our company of doing that. So we'd interviewed physios and those other two professions, but that's always been a better fit for us. So I don't know whether there is something around that.
Listen, I think there is. I think, and again, physio rightfully wanted to increase its sort of academic standing, because the strange thing was there probably wasn't enough evidence behind certain things that were done. We've now gone to an extreme, whereas if there's not evidence, we don't tend to do it, and that's not best practice. And I think what people are now waking up to realizing, best practice is definitely a scientific principle, but there's an art form to it. There's a biopsychosocial element to pain. There's also biopsychosocial element to many things. So it's trying to get that balance. And I think we've gone from one extreme potentially to another. But I think what we need to do is have a science principle behind things, but actually not be frightened to think of the art form. And every individual in front of us is unique. And I've often said it in my career of 35 years plus, I never once treated an injury. I did treat a lot of people who were injured. There's a big difference. So what will work for one may not work for the other. But there must be science behind what we do. So please don't think I'm not saying the science, but I do believe we've lost a little bit of practice-based evidence. We've all gone evidence-based, but there must be a bit of practice-based. There must be a little bit of gut feel, and gut feel doesn't come from your gut. It comes from your brain telling you, I've seen that situation before. This is likely to be the outcome. Do I understand the context? And I think that bit we've got a little bit, so for example, so many physios during lockdowns rightfully had to work, like we are talking now. But there still is a time you need to actually see, physically touch a patient and look at them. So there's a value in that type of service. I'm not saying it's wrong, but there's also a value in seeing people.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. That blend, as we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely, a blend, exactly.
Yeah. So then going back to when you went to Northumbria, then what was it like when you moved to Newcastle, and how was that experience?
It was probably a bit scary for me because I came from a small village in a small town, and suddenly going to a place where everybody, on the course I did, almost lived at home. So there wasn't really any social life. And I'll be honest with you, I can remember in the first year, one night going to a paying phone box, crying my heart out to my mum and dad saying, I want to leave, I can't stand it. I did, and I was like, I want to leave, putting 10 pence in the phone. This is not good enough. Mum phoning back that phone to talk to me, as many people have probably been in. And I remember they came to see me the next day, took me out for tea, and my dad just said, hey, see the first year out, son, and if you feel see the same, then give up, but see the first year out. And I saw the first year out, and I think I didn't not enjoy the course. I was just homesick, if I'm being honest, because I'd left friends, I'd left family, and I kind of felt a little bit lost. But it got you better, and it got a lot better. And then I suddenly started studying, realizing again, I know being a dyslexic, you've got to study much harder, and that's just a given, and that's not an excuse. You just have to work harder, and if you don't prepare to do it, you're not going to get anywhere. And so working hard was never a sacrifice to me. It was a necessity to get on, and I just buckled down, worked hard. And I remember I was fortunate in my third year on one of my placements, I worked in a pediatric school where there was an outstanding physio who was so dynamic, and she wanted to take a group of children from that school to what was called Les Autres, the alternative games in New York in 1984. And she asked me would I go along with them to help. And basically I went to look after 2 long-term muscular dystrophy boys who sadly were going to die within the next year. But they wanted to give them a holiday of a lifetime. And my job was to wash these boys, help dress these boys, turn them at night, drive one of the we hired little camper vans and had to drive through New York and into different parts of America with a wheelchair basketball and tour. And I think things like that shape you significantly, because you get to know these two young men who sadly did die within a year of coming back, and you hear their life story, and you deal with a football with a torn cruciate ligament and a young boy dying at 19. I know which one's a bit more significant.
Yeah. So how long were you away for on that trip?
That trip was just under 4 weeks. So it wasn't long, but it wasn't short either. And we went to the Les Autres games, and you saw people, the blind runners, you saw amputees high jumping over 2 meters, and you saw things that were incredible. And we then, as I said, you decided to take these boys down. We drove down to Washington, and we stopped off at different places with some of the other group who played basketball. And I would almost say it was giving them an experience of a lifetime. It gave me an experience of a lifetime too. But it was just, I still, can still see now as we're talking about it. Some of it's sad, but it was sort of more momentous to give these people such an experience in their short life. And I think it reminded me, and as I look back now, I didn't appreciate it at the time. We should never measure life, in my opinion, it's a little bit deep to say, by the length of the times you live. It should be the qualities of what you put into that life. And hopefully this gave those children a wonderful experience. And that's all I can say it is. And it's moving. It moves me now to think about it, because it doesn't, how can life be cruel to so many? But that to me was a great, what's the right word? Great background to work in sport, because it puts sport into perspective. It's a wonderful thing, sport. It is serious, but I really, Bill Shankly was one of the greatest auditors footballers ever had. But when he said, football is more important than life and death, I strongly disagree with him.
Yeah, Yeah, no, I can imagine that would be an incredible thing. Actually, one of the other people that we do some work with, and she's actually going to get her MBE today. I know you've had an award as well, which we'll talk about later on. But yeah, she set up a burns charity. She was in the Bali bombings. Her husband died. All of her wedding party, horrendous thing. But like, she put such positive things out there afterwards. And it's some horrendous stories doesn't really make you appreciate what you've got.
Absolutely.
In terms of that then, so like, did you ever think about maybe staying in that sort of area rather than moving to sport?
I did. What I did was when I qualified out, and again, the days of long ago, most of the physios didn't go straight into sport. We would go and work in the NHS, and I worked for 3.5 years in the Glasgow Royal Infirmary as what was known as a basic grade physio then. So you spent 4 months on it, maybe burns, orthopedics, general cardiothoracic, outpatients, and you rotate it around. And then I did 1 year as a senior physiotherapist in an amputee unit, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I loved working with amputees, and I was at the same time working part-time in sport, and I wasn't sure would I ever work full-time in sport, because it's not just about do you want it, it's getting the opportunities. And I wasn't really thinking that far ahead, because I loved the hospitals. I loved the multidisciplinary team working that you saw in hospitals, and just seeing the results and helping people achieve things. So I thought I had an idea I wanted to work in sport, but I wasn't necessarily driven to it. But I can remember one day when I was working in the hospital, I went down to a place called Lilleshall, just on a course run by BASM. And it was a week-long course. And I think the National Rehabilitation Centre run by the FA had literally just been set up then. And a guy called Graham Smith, who was running the centre then, and I just sort of knocked on the door one day and went in and started chatting to him. And I just said, do you ever do work experience or shadowing or anything? And he went, well, it's funny you should say that. He said, in the summer, physios have got going on holiday and I need cover. Would you prepare? He said, I can't pay you, but you come and work here for nothing for a week. I went, yeah, of course I will. It's an experience. And what I didn't realise at the time, Graham was potentially looking to take on another physiotherapist. And I worked for a week, and at the end of it, he said, I quite like the way you work. Would you be interested in a job if we interview you for it? And I just said, let me think about it. Yes. It was one of those, because it was a fantastic facility. It seemed a great place to go and work. And cut a long story short, I interviewed. And then so I left. I left my job in Glasgow 2 months later, left a lot of good friends, and took a chance in going to work for the English Football Association as a Scot, which again is no problem, because you're trying to better your career. And it was a great opportunity to work in then. And again, people want to give it context. People don't really appreciate today. In those days, most clubs had maybe one physiotherapist for the whole club, for the academy, for the first team, for everything. So therefore, the long-term injuries were often not poorly treated, were treated with a minimal amount of care, because that's all what was available. So therefore, a lot of clubs sent their long-term injured players there. There would maybe be 24 players a week turning up for rehabilitation. There would be 3 physios, so I would be looking after 8 players maximum, sometimes even less. And you would be catering for their whole needs from a Monday to a Friday. And the advantage of Lilleshall was you were taking players out of the club environment, where sometimes the club environment is irrespective of how good facilities and staff you've got. It's the wrong place to treat a long-term injured player. They don't like seeing the players train every day. It's sad. It's difficult for them. So I think, again, Lilleshall gave me the opportunity to really focus on long-term rehab, and I get to understand people, understand their anxieties, their worries about their contract, their families. There was a certain amount of psychological safety there. They were among other colleagues who were injured, and so it was a great credit to Graham for setting the facility up. And then it was run by a person called Philip Newton and his wife Pauline, who are outstanding physios, and they stayed there for probably 25, 30 years and gave a great service to football.
So what was your actual job title then?
I think initially it was senior physiotherapist. Just senior physiotherapist. I also did a little bit of work at the National School too, which was at Lilleshall. They set up the first academy, so I did a little bit of both. And I was the senior physiotherapist behind, and they say there was Philip, and then there was Graham, and then when Graham left, did I step up to be anything else? I don't think I did. I can't even really remember, if I'm being truthful. But it was almost, you were left to have your autonomy of looking after your own players. But Phil and I, and Graham when he was there, would regularly sit down and case formulate each player and what we were doing, why we were doing it, and what we thought would help them. And I think it's so important to sort of have those peers. And both I felt seriously at the time when I first went there, Graham and Phil was an outstanding clinician. Graham was an outstanding organizer and leader of teams, and I was way off their level, and but I knew that. And so I wasn't incompetent, but far from it. But I knew I would have to go back to my room every night and read more about injuries, more about rehabilitation, try and understand processes. But I was prepared to do it because I was fortunate in love with my profession, as I still am now, because I love it and I still do. So I still find it really exciting when people want to talk about injury management, but to get people playing, not necessarily the crux of just the injury for the player's sake. But I felt the environment was so positive to learn, and I then started working a little bit with gymnasts because they had no physio at the time, which then culminated me going to the 1992 Olympics. And so I got different experiences. We also worked with the National Jockey Club, and the jockeys had a lot of injuries they sent to Lilleshall. So eventually they employed me to spend, I think I spent nearly 2 months going around the country at the different race courses, looking at could we supply physio online to the jockeys and courses. So the nice thing about Lilleshall, although it was football centred, it wasn't. There was other things too, and I do believe football's very bad at just looking for the answers within football at times, when sometimes it's already there in other sport. And we treated rugby, I was fortunate enough to treat, for me, stars of my generation, people like Jonathan Davis, the rugby player. As I joked him, you scored too many good tries against Scotland, I dislike you, but it was fun. But you got to treat people like that who you found out were thoroughly good people. And just very normal people. Ian Woosnam lived in the area, so one regularly used to look after him, when he had problems with his neck and back as a golfer. And actually, it was lovely. I remember one week, I think I was treating people like Ian Woosnam. You were treating sort of Peter Scudamore, the national hunt jockey. You had Neil Foster, a cricketer, and you had Liam Brady, the footballer, and Ali McCoy. And it was and the eclectic group mixed really well together. And I think there's a camaraderie between sportsmen of appreciation, and that mix was a real. I mean, my learning just shot through the roof because both Phil and Graham put Graham put me under a lot of pressure. At times I wanted to wring his neck, but actually when I look back, it was the best thing he ever did for me, and I love him to bits for it because it's that type of pressure that brings your best out of you. But it was a really good learning environment.
So would they all come into Lilleshall then? So with Ian Woosnam, how would he come and see you?
Well, he only lived 45 minutes away, so it was very easy for him, and the rest of them. But when you think about the other people, you'd have people like Neil Foster, who was an Essex and England cricketer. The physio there would refer them to come for longer term rehabilitation. We had people like Chris Bailey, the tennis player, who tore his anterior cruciate ligament, and I think again it's like anything in life. If a centre gets a little bit of publicity, and in those days you have to remember these associations like the lawn tennis probably did. I can't quite totally remember, but I don't think they had their own facilities like they have now. They certainly didn't to the level and the in-depth planning. EIS didn't exist in those days. This is way before anything of this nature. So these sportsmen were often left to just fight and find their own way of doing things, and clubs referred people, and some of them you'd see as an outpatient, maybe just 2 or 3 mornings a week. Some of them, most of them, would arrive on a Monday and stay till the Friday. And occasionally some coming from different countries stayed over the weekend. But I think the big thing about Lilleshall, and unless people have been, you won't understand this, there's a 2-mile drive up to it. You are actually going into the middle of nowhere. There's and that creates such a great environment for long-term rehabilitation. Now, you don't want to stay there forever for obvious reasons, but it allows. I used to say to people, leave your baggage at the door, and when you come, just focus on yourself and what you want to do to get better. And I think that allowed them to physically work hard, but mentally be supported by each other and emotionally, and yet they could also probably accept their vulnerabilities, of which we all have.
That must have been an incredible time, because like football was the main sport you're working in then. You will have seen that change from like the Football League through to the Premier League, wasn't it? You stayed there until '94. So what was that like? Could you see that change?
Yeah, you saw things coming. You suddenly saw clubs were about to invest more money, not just in player salaries, but in training grounds, in infrastructure, and it was needed. And I would like to think Lilleshall was one of the pioneers for clubs trying to develop their own services. So, you fast forward it today, where you'll go to some clubs where they will have a physiotherapist, they'll have more than one physiotherapist, maybe 4 or 5 with, say, the first team, and 2 of them will never travel. They will just look after the long-term injured players, and it's right. I would suggest that sometimes you still are good to take the players away from the club, because I think they need that sort of mental and emotional break from the place from where they train. But clubs can afford to do that. So you could see this coming, and you could see the fact that the standard of physiotherapists, it wasn't poor. It was adequate for the time, but it could be better than it was. And so more courses were being organised. So the standard and duty of care was going to get greater, and it was changing and changing and changing. And, I knew at that time, I just so happened, I treated a number of players from Glasgow Rangers. And I can remember one day I was back up in Scotland. I think I'd been invited into the sort of the training ground, or they trained from the stadium in those days. So there wasn't even a training ground. And I can remember Walter Smith just passing a comment to me. He said, "Why should we keep sending players to you? You should come and work for us." And it was a kind of a throwaway comment, but I think he did obviously half mean it, because I ended up working there. But actually, it ended up being a long conversation of what is a club physio? Why? And I said to him, why does a club physio have to travel to every game when all of your long-term assets are injured and no one's looking after them? Surely if you've got 2 physio, one would be better staying. And he went, "Oh, I don't know if I think that's right or wrong. Never heard of that, never thought of it like that." And then I remember about 2 months later, he phoned me, he said, "I've been thinking about you. I'd like you to come and do that role." Because he said it makes total sense. And I'd also said, I think we should have another junior physio for the academy. And we were the first club in Britain that ever had 3 physios at Rangers. And again, that would be laughed at today, because clubs will have 9, 10. But it was the fact that Walter had the bravery to accept my vision and back the plan that I wanted to implement. And, the rest history. But it was just a casual conversation, or was it?
Yeah, obviously not. But so then you're going to Rangers, which at that point is one of the biggest clubs in the world. So what was that like going into there? Certainly as a Scot.
It was phenomenal. Listen, I'm not into bigotry, so would my family have been Celtic or Rangers fans? Irrelevant. They're Rangers fans, but I'm not into the bigotry that goes at all. I mean, many, Tim, who works at Celtic now as the head of sports medicine science, Williamson, is a guy who did a sort of a scholarship under myself at Rangers, and he's working there, and I will speak to him. So, I didn't like that side of Scottish football, but I love the rivalry. But Rangers, as you say, were a massive club, and at that time, at some of the best British players as the market, because many, if we go back to that time, English clubs were just coming out of being banned from playing in Europe because of Heysel. So Rangers were a phenomenally sized club. I mean, we signed in time with their people like Brian Laudrup, Paul Gascoigne, and you signed Paul Gascoigne with a fractured tib and fib and still not recovered, worry about him, will he be able to play? And when the chairman sells 55,000 shirts the next day with his name in the back and recoups the money in 1 second, you realise why they're signing players. It's not just about playing football. It's about bums on seats and commercial enterprise. And Walter Smith and Dick Advocat were outstanding coaches, but outstanding people. And I learned, I used to say the best physiotherapist I ever worked with was Walter Smith. And people ask, what do you mean he's a coach? He was not a physio. But he could turn around to me and often say, he'll be back a week quicker than you think. No, he'll take 2 weeks longer than you think. And invariably he was right, because he understood people. He understood what they needed to do to be able to perform. And it was a great learning time. And we were fortunate. We were very, very, very successful, in winning a lot of trophies, if that's how you define success. I define it slightly differently. But that, from the persona of success, we're very, very successful. We're not fortunate. We deserved to win 9 championships in a row. We could have won 10, but we didn't quite. We failed by 2 points. And that was failing. But we had some great times there. And then Alex McLeish came in, And actually, I clashed with Alex very early, but it wasn't his fault, it was mine. Because I had been working with two very successful managers who liked what I did and how I did it. And I was quite a strong character in those days. I still am, but I know how to hold my tongue a bit better now, because when Alex came in, he was a bit like, well, Grant, I think we should change certain things, how we do, and do them this way. Well, I'm not going to change them. What do we need to change for? We don't do it. We've been successful doing it this way. So 18 months later, when he sacked me, which I think was the right thing to do, and I've thanked him since, because I think it was appropriate. Because sometimes you've got to learn that actually there are many more ways to do one thing than you think. And it did me the world of good being sacked. It really did, because it made me really analyse who I am, what I am. Did it hurt? Of course it did. Did you feel begrudged for a little while? Of course you do. But then you realise the only person that's beating yourself up about this is yourself. There's no point. And actually, the person who's done you a great favour. You've gone to work for another great football club. You've learned masses. You've made some football friends for life. You've had some great times. Move on.
So how does that happen then? So when you're getting sacked then, so how does that actually transpire? Are you expecting it, or is it a sudden thing?
Do this may sound a real, what's the right word? Grant's making this up. No, I'm not. I was actually driving in to the Rangers training ground to hand in my notice. Because at that stage, I realised Alex and I weren't getting on. We were getting on badly, but we were just misaligned. And I thought, and I've been fortunate enough to have been speaking to Middlesbrough about potentially moving there. And I'd agreed terms to go to Middlesbrough. So I got a phone call from the chief executive saying, Grant, I'd like you to come into the office for a chat, please. And again, I got on very well with the chief executive, Martin Bain, who just said, Grant, we're going to change the way the medical system's running. We want to bring in a full-time doctor, so he will run it, so therefore we're making your position redundant. So will you accept redundancy? And again, I was very inexperienced, but I said yes. And within probably 3 hours, we'd agreed what I was going to get to go, because the next day I was signing a 5-year contract to work for Middlesbrough. And it sounds nice because you've been paid to go, and yet you're signing a contract the next day for a club to go and work for, for a 5-year period. But you're still hurt. You're still, upset. But actually, when I look back, Alex did the right thing. He did. And I've spoken to him a number of occasions since, and I don't hold any grudges to him. He honestly, seriously helped my career massively. So I've got a lot to thank him for giving me a good kick up the backside.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And then just talking about your time at Rangers then, so you mentioned Paul Gascoigne and Gazza. Yeah. So what was that like? I mean, again, that's also talking about Brian Laudrup as well. He's possibly the best player I've ever seen live play. But so what was it like with those two players, starting with Gazza?
Gazza was I think the best footballer I've ever seen play in my life, in my period of working with teams. There's other people, Messi, Ronaldo, I've not worked with them, so I'm talking about players I've worked with. He was outstanding and a character, and you knew the psychological baggage that he carried, which was not necessarily partly his fault. It was partly things that had happened in his past. But underneath it, there was a very kind, considerate, insecure person. And that's what you see now. But, he would take his own jacket off if you didn't have one. He would do anything to anyone to help them. He was thoroughly a prankster around the building and genuinely a good guy. I mean, generally, I had a good relationship with him, very good relationship with him. But it was based, hopefully, on me wanting to try and help him play as many games of football and listen to him when he had difficulties. And he did, but he was an outstanding player. And I find it sad sometimes when I see, where he is now, because, we all have a responsibility to try and help a person, but he was on the football field a free spirit. And I would like to think we can all remember him for that, and certainly off the field, a very kind person to everyone, and a good team person. Where Brian Laudrup was a very much more individual, probably mixed with the players, but not overly, very happy to go home to his family and wife, came in and trained and left. Was very much, probably none of us formed a close relationship with him, but none of us were distant to him either. He was just, it was business, but an outstanding player. outstanding, and trained very well too. So was a good trainer. Trained hard, played hard, but actually that's all he wanted. And some people want that. It's a business. Whereas people like Paul Gascoigne want to be more around people, want to be, involved in things where someone like Brian wouldn't be. But as you say, but again, to get the most out of them, you'd have to treat them both completely differently.
Yeah. I mean, you got some others legends there, like Ali McCoist and all of those people. So what was like the atmosphere like in the training grounds and the team?
Very jovial, in a good way. I mean, training was serious, and I think that's what people forget. People like Ali McCoist were, yes, a joker off the field and a prankster, and would be playing practical jokes. But when they trained hard, really hard. They were. Don't be kidded by their humour and wanting to do things and being the way they were. When they trained, they took it very. They trained like they played, and they played to win. And they wouldn't. And if they weren't winning. The time I was there with Walter Smith, I think we lost 3 games in a row twice, and it's crisis time. You don't do it, and the players sort that out. They don't need the manager to tell them. They knew what serious and winning was, and their expectations of the public. And you need people like Ali McCoy, Steve Durant, Richard Gough. They're the cultural architects of Rangers and of football, and the standards and what's accepted and what's not accepted. And in many ways, people like that, Ian Ferguson's of this world, they induct the Brian Laudrups, the Paul Gascoigne's, Andy Gordon was probably a bit in both camps. But what I'm saying is they induct them into the standards that are necessary. In those days, players maybe went out a little bit more. They weren't drunk every week, but they went out and had a release now and then. But if that actually affected performance, the players stopped it. We are living in a completely different era now. But these players played hard. They wanted to win. Don't get me wrong, they were real winners, and that's why they achieved so much.
Yeah. And then my favourite ever player of all time is Duncan Ferguson. So would you just had a little bit of crossover with him?
No, I didn't. He left, I think, about a month before I started, because he went to was he on loan at Everton at first? Or did he go straight to Everton? I can't quite remember.
He was on loan for.
That's right. I think he was on loan, and then when I came, he had literally gone, and he had a hard time at Rangers. He probably didn't work out as well as he'd wanted. But I mean, as you say, a fit Duncan Ferguson is a wonderful asset for any side.
Yeah. No, well, we had weeks where Everton got him and Ian Durant on loan for a period.
That's right. I remember Ian going there too.
Yeah.
And Ian taught me so much, because Ian probably jokes, I brought you to Rangers because he spent so much time at Lilleshall with a horrendous knee injury. And he's, he spent 2.5 years coming on and off for a period of time, but got back to be a phenomenal player. And would he have been even better if he hadn't been injured? More than likely, but we don't know the answer to that. But he went on and had a great career and was a phenomenal person around the building.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. Yeah, I always had a bit of an obsession with that Rangers period that you were there. Yeah. Just must have been an incredible time. So
well, it was incredible times, and it was good people. And I think the thing that I take most from it is the fact that I know it's like Richard Gough and I. We haven't spoke for 2 or 3 years because Richard lives in America, and I just tried to contact him recently about something. Within 5 minutes, he was back in touch, and we ended up trading emails all that night. And so you build relationships with people that last forever, even though you won't see everyone all the time.
But yeah, I mean, even he came to Everton for a bit when he was like 37, 38, and he was brilliant for Everton. Like, it was just a physical specimen.
Yes, Richard Gough was probably one of his players today are more athletic than they used to be, partly because of the advancements in sports science and strength and conditioning and the way the game's played. If Richard had been brought up in that era, he'd have been an even better athlete, and he was a phenomenal athlete.
Yeah, no, well, that's great. So when you moved to Middlesbrough then, so who was the manager there at that point?
Steve McLaren. And Steve took me to Middlesbrough, and Steve was a very organised coach who had a multidisciplinary team around him, from head sports scientist and Chris Barnes, me looking after the medical side. And there was people like Paul Barron, goalkeeping coach, Steve Harrison, Bill Bezic, so they had a team of people, who were responsible and wanted to take Middlesbrough forward.
And so what was it like going into that environment? Like I say, Bill Bezic, he'd obviously invested in the infrastructure there.
Yeah, it was I think they were on a journey because in some respects, no disrespect to Middlesbrough, Rangers at that time were a far bigger club, had a far bigger outlook on what they wanted to do. Poor Bill probably was trying to persuade the club that they needed to evolve their lens, and they were evolving, but they weren't where they wanted to be. They were there from the point of view on the pitch with players they were signing, but things were a little bit slow to get things done. But they were a smaller club run on a smaller budget, so maybe that's a good thing because they were run prudently by Keith Lamb, the chief executive. And I felt I learned a different bit there about trying to budget, about trying to sort of put a business case for buying certain things to help the players, and had to justify it. But that was good because I'm not a great believer in being able to spend money for the sake of it. It's got to be for a reason. So there were some good people under Steve, and Steve was an outstanding coach. And the club were very successful because they won their first ever trophy in their history in the first year I was there. Nothing to do with me, I hasten to add. But the fact they had done that, and if you see Rangers fans expect to win. So if you don't win, you're in trouble. Middlesbrough won the first first trophy in their history. You could see the joy on their fans' face. Whereas at Rangers, that's an expectation.
Mm. So what was that then in terms of that trophy? Which trophy was that one then?
That was the Carling Cup, which I don't know what it's called these days, the League Cup, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. So, and that was against Bolton in the final, and they won 2-1 at the Millennium Stadium, Cardiff. And a great occasion for the fans, the players, and the management, because that's what they were brought in to achieve, and that led to 2 runs in the UEFA Cup. One the first year where we just were getting used to it. The second year we got in because of, I think we finished in 6th place in the league, which again is phenomenal for Middlesbrough, or was it 7th? I can't quite remember. But we got into the year, and we got to the final that year, which again, for a town of 130,000 people to get to a UEFA Cup final is phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal.
I remember that was where Macaroni, he was right. He started that.
Absolutely, and it was a wonderful cup run, and it's a great journey. We lost the final 4-0 to Seville, and it wasn't a 4-0 defeat. It was 1-0 after, I think, 82 minutes, and then 2-0, and we chased the game. So we deservedly lost, and we didn't play well, which was disappointing. But a phenomenal achievement to get to a final in itself.
Yeah. In terms of some of the players that you had there, then are there any ones that particularly stand out, either from like the physical attributes or just from a performance level?
Obviously, the captain, Gareth Southgate, first. I mean, Gareth and his journey speaks for itself, and I think you need to say no more. He achieves what he achieves because he excels. He excels in everything he does, but he excels in being a good person. And I think, that stands out to him. Probably one of the players I got closest to, who sadly died 3 or 4 years ago, Hugo Ekio, who was an absolute colossal giant of a man on the pitch, but also off it. Mark Schwartz, goalkeeper, who was, again, a very, very good professional, who went on and had a great career. You had people like George Boateng, and I always smile because George was an effervescent, just bubbly, but a good person around the training ground. And we had a lot of what we also had at Middlesbrough was an outstanding group of young academy players coming through under a guy called Dave Parnaby, who was academy manager, who was probably one of my closest football friends because we loved talking about the game and what it meant. And Dave brought through, if you think about people like Stuart Downing, Andrew Taylor, James Morrison, just to name a few, who have gone on and had outstanding careers in football. Lee Catham, it goes on and on and on. And so Middlesbrough should be very proud of their ability to produce young players, and so a lot of good characters in that group.
No, absolutely. Then, so then at that point, you how did you come to leave there? So was it a slightly different role that you were looking for at that point?
No, do you know what? No, I wasn't looking for any role. Basically, what happened was I'd signed an extension of my contract at Middlesbrough. And Middlesbrough at that stage had gone into the Championship, and my contract they had deemed to be on a Premiership wage. So they served notice on me, which they had to give me a year's notice, and they said I could leave within a year's money. And I said, well, I'll stay for 6 months if you like, because I'll leave at the end of the season and you pay me. And they were fine with that. But then they said, well, we would like you to stay and take a 60% pay cut. And I went, no, thanks. Because I had nothing to go to. I had nothing at all to go to. And at that time, the FA had approached me to see would I, because they knew I was going to be, out of work with Middlesbrough, and the Under-20 World Cup was coming up in Colombia. Would I be available to go with that? So why not? Great experience, did that. And then at the same time, I was approached by an agency through Manchester City to say they had a number of jobs going at the first team. One was the head physio, one was head of sports medicine with the first team. Would I be interested? And I went, well, have you got any other jobs? And they said, well, we're potentially going to have a head of sports medicine and science at the academy role, but that won't interest you. And I went, well, I don't know, it might. And because I'd spent 25 years at first team football with Lilleshall, Rangers and Middlesbrough, you do get worn down, you get tired, you do get tired of working 7 days a week. And I'd speaking to my friend Dave Barnaby and David, trying to persuade me to go for the academy because he knew I loved working with young people. I think they're exciting. People say they're silly. I love their silliness because you're meant to be silly when you're that age. I'm still silly at my age, so why shouldn't you be silly? But I applied for that role, and cut a long story short, I had 3 very extensive interviews. I wasn't given a job, nor should you be. And we talked a lot about what the job looked like and what it should be. The salary was really not that important because I didn't want to move just for the sake of it. But cut a long story short, the sort of academy director then, Mark Allen, and the managing director, Brian Marwood, were people who I'd met, who I got a really good steer and feel for what they wanted from the club. And I felt as if I could help out in the academy role. And so I took that role, not knowing within a year I'd be back at the first team for a period of time because there was internal politics, as sometimes happens, and I had to go back to the first team. But that was a nice stepping bit back into it. But the role was to go to the academy and eventually form a performance service lead, of which I became. And the fascinating thing was, when I look back, there was no talk of us ever having women's football evolved, but ultimately, by the time I left, I was sort of overseeing the women's program, which thankfully now has got its own lead because it's developing, and it just shows you don't always know what's going to be in the future, but embrace it because it's exciting.
And so when they didn't mention the women's bit, did they sell the vision? Because it's just incredible what was developed in East Manchester.
Yeah. Oh, listen, they had a vision and they knew they were on a rocket and it was going to go some places, and it was going to, yes, they had capital to invest, but they wanted to do it properly. It wasn't just let's spend money. It was like, well, we need a training ground. We need staff. What is the structure going to look like? What's the duty of care look like? Where are we lacking? And it was nice to be part of a group of people who had a blank bit of paper. You see certain clubs at the moment, and organisations, not just clubs, but organisations that have tradition. And tradition is wonderful in one respect. It doesn't stop progress. But in so many clubs, you can see it stops progress. This is the way we do things around here. Well, that's the worst statement in business. And that was what that was. I remember Farhan, the chief executive at Manchester City, saying that we will make mistakes, but I want vision. We need to go places quickly. We need to do things differently. And that was the challenge. And if you came up with ideas that looked good and they looked good from a business angle, you were backed, and that was lovely. That was a really, what's the right word? Lovely thing to be part of, because when I look back and I look at the training ground and I look at systems I helped put in, so I don't think it was down to me. It wasn't. It was down to a lot of people that hopefully have helped the club on their journey. If they're still using those, I hope not. I hope they've evolved on to better, because then they are being too traditional. And I think when I go back and I see things being done differently, people say to me, are you disappointed by that? No, I love it. It's being built on. I look on it when you hold a job like that. It's a bit like you're running the final, the 4x400 meter relays. You've run a race and you've put them in a good place to someone else to take the baton. How they take it and run their race is down to them. And really, quite frankly, yes, I want them to do well, but it's not that important of how I did the job. It's now how the job should be done.
Yeah. And how involved would you be? We say like Pep Guardiola. Does he get involved at all with what you were doing?
Not too much, because the system was that big enough, but he would know what was happening. He would understand. He would be more interested on the product. So he's not interested in what we were doing. He's more interested in a Phil Foden coming through. And as long as those sort of players are coming through the system, people like that are delighted. And on top of that, the other players that aren't quite as good are being sold to make more money so he can buy other players. So, the remit is a big one, but the philosophy of play and the style of what Manchester City wanted to do was well in place well before Pep came, but it was based on him coming one day. So let's not be silly about that. But it was based on a beautiful game, played in a certain manner that he would, when he came, he would just take on. But what Pep will do one day is leave it in a better place for someone else to take further. It doesn't mean it has to start again. What is, so the philosophy is very, very, very well established there now. But I'm sure it'll be evolving all the time.
Yeah, and what do you think? Again, you've come from, say, Middlesbrough. You were talking about the youth system now. Is one of the things about the big clubs is that they just they're starting so young for getting people through. And you've got the huge clubs that will get the lion's share, like Chelsea, Man City, Man United. What's like your view on like the impact of that compared to, say, like the non-league progression and that sort of thing?
It's a really good question, and there's no easy answer, because the best want the best. And if they can get it early, it saves them money. But sometimes you have to ask yourself the question, is, Phil Foden's an exception. Phil Foden, from the 11 or 12, the majority of people would have predicted if he didn't get a significant injury or something went wrong, he'd be playing in the first team. So has the system produced him, or is it just the fact he's an outstanding talent? A bit of both. But what you do need is a system to develop players. And, some players will never play in Manchester City's first team or Manchester United's or Chelsea unless they go on loan 2 or 3 times, maybe like Harry Kane at Spurs. So there are lots of different ways of doing things. If your son or daughter is not of the standard of those type of players, are they maybe better in a small club where they're going to get more of an opportunity? The answer is probably yes. But as a parent, you have a choice. You don't have to sign for Manchester United, Manchester City or Chelsea. You can sign for Bury. You can sign for Oldham. You can sign for Sheffield United. All fantastic clubs. So don't think clubs are holding guns to these. They're deciding who they're signing for. So you make your choice. Yeah. And I think it's very much sometimes loaded. All the big clubs do this wrong. The big clubs do that wrong. Big clubs don't go around to your house with a machine gun and say, sign or else we're going to shoot you. Well, they don't do that. They may be offering them a pathway with more incentives. But actually, look below the detail and look at what is their football pathway. The good parents will look beyond what is the financial implications, because that will come at any stage anyway. It's more about, what should be done for their son and daughter or son from an educational perspective, from a well-being perspective, and a financial perspective. It shouldn't be finance. And I'm not saying it is for all, because it isn't. But it's important parents make an informed choice.
Yeah, and absolutely. That someone like Jadon Sancho, so he was an example that did leave there. Was he always someone that the club could see was going to be a star?
Jadon Sancho, from a very young age, was, he could do things other people couldn't do, and at a high talent, and was, again, more of a maverick maybe personality than Phil, but he had phenomenal talent, and everyone's saying to me at the moment he's in a little bit of a dip, but that happens to every player at times. That sort of, the form is temporary, class is permanent. He's a class player. It'll come.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you saw some incredible talent coming through there. And then when did you decide to leave Man City?
I decided I was thinking about it maybe at least for 18 months before I did. Not that I didn't like it. I just felt you get to an age where I've been working 32 years very hard non-stop, and it takes its toll on you. Physically, I'd had a health scare. And I'm 59 now, and you suddenly realise life's passing by quite quickly without opportunities to do other things. I was lucky at City. They gave me opportunities I've been approached by Circus Soleil to do some troubleshooting in America. I've done that. I've been asked to speak at conferences in different parts of the world. They'd allowed me to do that. So they were brilliant with me. But I just felt I wanted to do something different. I also wanted to come and live in the Isle of Arran, where I do now, building a house here. And I wanted to, try myself working for myself just to see what was out there. And did I know I was going to pick up work? No, I didn't. But I was confident enough to know what I could do. And so I gave the club a year's notice, and I didn't have to. And they were very good. They said, "Oh, we'd like you to stay. Is it about money? We can offer you a new contract." I said, "No, it's not about money. I'm leaving." And they were even more grateful about that, because you don't hold clubs to ransom that way. That's not to me not the way to behave. And I wasn't about money, and so therefore they gave me a consultative contract, of which I still have with them. So I still do some work with them, and but I wanted to give them plenty of notice, so they could look at how they wanted to do things and shape things so it was as seamless as possible. And it wasn't sensational. It was not, as I said to you, I left on very good terms. because I think sometimes, it's nice to leave on your terms and help them. And so that's what we did in 2018, which doesn't seem that long ago, but it's over 3 years. It's gone like that. And, here we are now.
Mm. And so what was your vision then when you were deciding to do this then? What was your plan?
Well, my plan was to do one of two things: offer myself to clubs as a critical friend and set up a mentorship scheme for younger, either S&C coaches, physios, sports scientists, anyone who wants to work in sport, to offer them some advice externally as like a mentorship package. And I've been fortunate now that I still, I say, got some work for the City Football Group. I do some work for like that on the Scottish Football Association. I also do some for Aberdeen and Ross County, and I mentor about 14 people privately, on their development, and I do a little bit of teaching for the Premier League on some of their courses, on their educational programs. So I've got a nice eclectic mix still, and it was. I probably, if I wanted to turn this into a full-time business, I could, but I don't want to. So that's not that I'm, I do turn work down, but it's not. I've done a couple of big audits I've done 3 audits for different clubs in the Premier League in men and women's football, and 1 internationally. In fact, 2 internationally, about their service level of provisions, what it looks like, and how it should work. And so it's not. What's the right word? It's almost quality assurance. Is the medicine and science safe? Is it optimal for performance, and how is it audited and how it can be reviewed? And I go in and look at the people, I look at the processes, I look at context of their development, and look at what technology they use to see how it can all come together. And so I've got my own bespoke little model for that, and I kind of hopefully can offer clubs an ability to improve their present level of staff without having to always think about, we need to get a new person in. It's how do they develop, because continuous professional development is for life. It doesn't stop just because you've got grey hair and a bit of experience. It's got to go on and on. And I think if you're not prepared to learn, why are you doing the job? I mean, the knowledge we gain is one thing, and it will help us tomorrow, but it won't offer us all the solutions.
Mm. Yeah.
You talked before about the value of ultrasound scanning at a club. Well, when I went to Rangers, that didn't exist. It probably started to exist a little bit at Middlesbrough, much more at Manchester City. And I see the value in it massively, being able to monitor pathology, but actually it's only as valuable as the person interpreting the pictures. So as you've rightfully said, you could sell them a good machine, but if you don't sell them a good educational package, it'll be a bit like Grant Downie driving a Ferrari. It's a bit dangerous because I don't know where the brake is.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. It sounds like it's a great opportunity for you to kind of use it in your own way for working with a lot of different areas, and you can start imparting that and understanding what could assist.
Well, you said it very well. It's starting with understanding. So give context. Don't. So, for example, I went to La Liga club in Spain before lockdown, and I was asked to go in there to look at the number of hamstring injuries they've had, and because it was too high. So you can imagine the staff initially, who don't speak a lot of English, and don't trust me 1 minute, are hardly talking to me. And then eventually we get a moment breakthrough in the meeting where one of the members of staff holds her hand up. Could I ask you a question, sir? Don't call me sir, but yeah, have you ever had a recurring hamstring injury? And I'm about, yes. And I went on to great depth about how at the time at Middlesbrough, we had a centre forward who had a nasty hamstring injury and was not, at times, not the easiest person to work with, but was a good guy. So I don't want people to think that. But, difficult from a rehab perspective, was probably out the best part of 9 months, and she'd have been out 3, and a lot of it down to just, sort of take my responsibility in that. So I told them all about that story. Suddenly they started talking to me. They realised there was a human being at the end of this conversation. I wasn't an auditor with a clipboard saying, you must do this, you must do that, you must do that. I've been there. I used to do a standard talk to physios on hamstring injuries, and in the audience, and the first thing I used to say in the audience is, anyone here within the audience never had a recurring hamstring injury? You often get 1 or 2 smart young physios put their hand up. So I say, would you like to come on the stage and give the talk? Because you're far better than I am. And I think, so what you try and do is when you're forming these relationships, I was speaking to a new head of academy physio yesterday who maybe wants me to do some mentoring with him, and he was just asking me about things, and I went, asking him a lot about himself and how he saw the world. And what you have to try and do is create a connection. And it's not about, well, I can do this for you, I can do that for you. It's, these are some of the tough situations you're going to face. How are you going to deal with them? Have you thought about that? How could I help you make those decisions easier for you? How can I challenge you on that to make sure you're doing the right process? And so it's having an ability to check, having an ability to challenge, but most importantly, sometimes support. And a critical friend can do all those and he's on your side, but can remind you at times you're not as good as you think you are, but also remind you you're not as bad as you think you are at times too.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely good advice. So in terms of like your OBE, how did that come about?
Do you know, it's funny, isn't it? I remember actually I was back working with the first team at Manchester City and I wasn't going home for the weekend because I think we had a game on the Saturday or the Sunday, and Sue, my partner, said, oh, there's a letter here coming from Her Majesty's Service or something. She opened it, read it out, cut a long story short, it's from the Prime Minister offering you an OBE, and I'm thinking, which one of my friends is taking the P? But it wasn't. So, and again, what you find is you're nominated by this, and it was nominated by a number of people, including a couple of eminent orthopaedic specialists who I'd worked with at times when I was at Middlesbrough, Gareth Southgate, English FA through Gary Lewin and a few other people, and then you're offered to become an officer of the British Empire, and it's weird at first, it's a bit unreal. You have to post something to say it's going to accept it. And you're thinking, I hope that letter gets there, because it's not just for you, it's for your parents. It's for the remedial teachers when I had to go to a remedial school because I couldn't read and write at 11. It's for all those people who've inspired you to be a better version of yourself. And it's very emotional to a point too, because you realise it's an honour. It's a big, big honour. But actually, the most important thing is, why have you got it? Is partly because of the work you've done, and also I did do a lot of work with young people who are dyslexic and still, try and help people who've got some difficulties, because we all at times need a champion. And I'm a great believer, if you've ever watched the Rita Pearson sort of TED talk on what a champion is, and champion is someone who never gives up on a child, even though they may only get 1 out of 20 right, because 1 out of 20 is a start. And I think we all need them. And so I know I've championed a number of people, but the purpose of doing it is to try and get them to do the same for others. And I think in life, so getting an OBE was just probably a culmination of all of that, and a wonderful honour. Irrespective, some people don't believe in an honour system, and that's their right. No one should say it's right or it's wrong, but for me, it was a great honour. And does it mean that I go through a room and say, my name's Grant Downie, OBE? No, I don't. My name's Grant Downie. I have an OBE, but it's not Grant Downie OBE. No, there's a difference.
Yeah, well, no, great achievement nonetheless. So no, that was
well, thank you. Yeah, and it feels it, and it was very proud to get it, and I was proud to accept it, and I don't belittle it, but I don't like people who think they can use that to get things that the other folk can't.
Yeah,
it's a privilege and an honour. It's not to be taken for granted.
No, definitely. And then you mentioned about sort of assisting other people. Who do you think's had the biggest influence, or people numerous that have had the biggest influence on your career?
Walter Smith for certain. He had two older doctors working under him. One of them called the late Alistair Ogilvie, who was an outstanding sports physician and just good doctor. Donald Cruikshank, who was a Dr. Rangers, Graham Smith, Philip Newton helped me massively. I think from a playing perspective, when you look at players who help you, Ali McCoist was a great confidant. So was Richard Gough. Gareth Southgate, we still speak pretty regularly now. If he was alive, I'd be speaking to Ugo Ekiog regularly. He was a very good person. Then you go to Manchester City, and there's Dave Parnaby at Middlesbrough. And then at Manchester City, I have a lot of time for Brian Marwood, who is a real sounding good judge of people. And there was, I could mention you 25, 30 staff at Manchester City. And people forget that. As a club, they're often known as, they've got this, they've got that. You know what they've got? They've got a great group of people. And there are too many to mention. And so I don't want to single out without missing out others. But I keep saying, processes are vital, but processes work because of good people. They fail because of bad people. To start with people. So you go into organisations, as I joke and say to some of them, I'm here to change people, or you change the people. So one can be ruthless too, because you have to be at times. Because if people don't want to change and move with you, you need to change them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Man City certainly seems to have got it right from an external perspective. It just seems like just Amazing.
At the moment, they've got it right, and I don't mean that in a negative way. What I'm saying is what you do today won't be good enough tomorrow. They certainly, at the time I was there, had enough people looking for tomorrow. I hope they keep doing that, because if you think about sustained success, it's having a group of people who are planning for the next stage. It's not just about what we're doing today. And I think there's too many people, what's the right word? Will wallow in success, and we are successful. And certain clubs, that they're out there who've done that, and organisations that they did things a certain way, and they're very happy to carry on doing them that way, and that's why they're probably not being as successful now. And to keep up with people, you've got to have a visionary on the, they've got to have people who, Pep rightfully will be concentrating on winning the league. That's his job, but he will also have staff who are looking, well, who are the new players going to come in for the following season? He'll have half. I'm not saying half his brain, but some of his brain thinking of that next step all the time. That's why he's such a successful coach.
Yeah, definitely. And then in terms of this, you must have had loads of these, so it's a difficult question. But last one, what would you say is the most memorable moments?
Oh dear, I've been asked that, and I've never been able to answer it. So because I've been fortunate, there's been many, but I think I'll just give you an example. It's maybe not quite what you're asking, but I think it'll sum it up. Because I've had so many, last Friday, I was down in Birmingham speaking at an event for the Premier League. And on the Thursday night, as I arrived into the event, which was run for the coaching programmes of the Premier League, Garth Crooks was there. And Garth, I treated at Lilleshall, and hadn't seen for probably 25 years, but he recognised me, I recognised him. I remembered what knee injury he had, and we started talking about it. And many of the people on the course, he'd helped get onto this course. And football is a game played by people. And if you're, as a person, able to connect with these people, these relationships last forever, even though you very rarely see people. I have that happen quite a lot. So when I'm speaking to one of the coaches in Aberdeen, who used to be my boot boy at Rangers, who ended up playing at Middlesbrough, and those are the highlights of the career, because they don't end. And so you can win that. And so what I'm saying is, you asked me before about success at Rangers. Success was relationships. Success was, sadly, at Middlesbrough, understanding the grief of Gemma Ekeog when her husband died, having spent time with her in America with Hugo when he had a significant injury, and still being able to text her. And so for me, the highlights are the relationships you formed as people, because I don't think there's any job will afford you to have this, the closeness of it's almost a band of brothers and sisters. It's not brothers, it's sisters too, that you form. And I think those are the things that I'll take with me all my life. And those are things I won't remember. I would remember the trophies, but they're not that. They're just by the by. It's the relationships I'll take with me.
Yeah, no, good answer. No, that's a good answer. So no, brilliant. No, well, on that note, I really appreciate your time on this. I've really enjoyed it. Some great insight. Again, I love the area that you've worked in. So no, it's fascinating to get some inside insight in that. So no, I really appreciate your time on it.
My pleasure. Glad I can help anytime.
No, great. And I hope that when you're back on the mainland, then please give me a shout.
I will, with pleasure.
Thanks, Grant.
Thank you.